I was sitting in an airplane on the tarmac in Sacramento, and the PA system crackled to life. Apparently it was something coming from the cockpit. And this voice came over and it said, we want to update you on our progress. Yes, and you could feel this kind of groan that went through all of us sitting in this airplane on the tarmac there. Update was a code word that it wasn't fixed yet. We wanted to get going. But this very kind of overly cheerful voice said that they have identified a difficulty in a communication boards and that the technicians are looking for a solution. We took off about an hour late. School has now really begun. This is just to remind you that if you are in the other retreats, you would get to eat now rather than have to sit here and listen to a Dhamma talk. There is one of the groups that's gone, but the group that's down here, I think, still has another day. Or two?
That's correct. We could move in there Wednesday, but they have been they've been lighting fires every evening, so the place is going to smell like a smokehouse. So whether or not we want to move in there or not, we should determine that on Wednesday and see if the environment is suitable to sit in without fumes, the smoky fumes chasing us out. TBD, to be determined.
Who by? Will you update us?
Probably the most sensitive of those is, would you like to be one of them?
We need all the canaries to check it out.
All the canaries, yeah, we agree that it's fine and in order.
Okay.
Is a solution coming forward?
A solution is coming forward. There's a solution will come forward. It's going to take about an hour. It has to do with the communication boards and us figuring out why we can't have campfires in here if they can have campfires in there.
This has turned out to be pretty good, so we may just want to keep rolling and let's see how it goes, and we'll make that choice on Wednesday collectively.
Meanwhile, that's only 53 minutes have gone. You know, I still have 53 minutes before the plane takes off, so we'll have to keep chatting here. We took off about an hour late. And I was flying to the East Coast to officiate my nephew's wedding. And my itinerary had a 57-minute layover in Dallas. And so I had planned, I love Tex-Mex food, so I was going to get Tex-Mex food in Dallas and stretch my legs a little bit before we got my plane for the next leg. But instead, what I had to do was I had to sprint from Terminal C to get all the way around to Terminal E. And when I got there, they were just about to close the doors. The attendants had already given my seat away to somebody else, but they found another seat, and I got on the plane just as they were closing the door behind me. So I was a little worn and hungry, and I'm vegetarian, and I have difficulty with gluten. And so you can imagine trying to buy a meal on an airline. Well, they did have this, I called it a Greek something or other, which I bought, which had 2 slices of cooked carrot, I think 1 slice of cooked zucchini, and a little bit of hummus for $12. I love to look out the windows of airplanes. They gave me a seat on the aisle, and the woman who was sitting by the airplane window closed the shade there because she wanted to watch the movie. And meanwhile, the person who was sitting between us, this woman, in very short order, put down 3 of those little bottles of liquor of some kind that they sell on the plane. And she put on the headphones to watch the movie and just started laughing. Everything, yes. So I was not interested in the movie. I was not interested in laughing. I worked on my computer a little bit. I read a little bit. I stared at a Sudoku puzzle blankly for a little bit. And the air was kind of turbulent, so they had to keep our seatbelts on. I couldn't get up and walk around. So after a while, there was really nothing left that I could figure out to do except to meditate. And I didn't want to meditate because I had all this aversion, you know, all the things that had not gone the way that I wanted them. But there was nothing, you know, I closed my eyes, and, you know, so what do I do? So I closed my eyes, and what I noticed was I was just absolutely too worn down to fight all the aversion that was inside me. So I didn't even try. I just let the cranky thoughts do whatever they wanted, and I just relaxed into all of them. And surprisingly, the aversion didn't turn out to be this grubby pack of monsters that I anticipated. Instead, it felt more like a 4-year-old who's complaining that his dad cut the sandwich from corner to corner rather than side to side. You know, there was true suffering, but it was really kind of cute and endearing to watch all this stuff going on inside me. And with all this, I remembered once again, it's one of the most essential meditation lessons that I seem to have to learn over and over and over again, which is that resistance is futile. Resistance is futile. Fighting reality, wanting things to somehow be different than what I want, is, Gene Houston called it schlock suffering. You know, there is a certain amount of discomfort that comes along with life that's unavoidable, but schlock suffering is the suffering that comes up from trying to avoid the unavoidable. So it's like any time we have the hubris to think that somehow reality ought to be different just because we want it to be different, that creates unnecessary suffering. So the aversion inside me it felt more like this rolling ocean wave, you know, that I could see coming rolling towards me. And you know what happens on a beach if you try to run away from a wave? It's likely to catch you from behind and knock you flat. So what the Buddha recommended was, rather than run from the waves, just turn towards them. Can't get away from them, so turn towards them and relax into them. And if we do that to the waves, then we begin to we experience very quickly what its true nature is. You know, the wave is just water. It's not so bad. And then we come up into this little wake between the waves, which is kind of peaceful. So sitting on the airplane, I learned this lesson for the 1000th time. You know, I just over and over and over, because these old habits of turning away from things are so deeply ingrained that I just have to keep on remembering to relax in until that becomes a stronger habit. Becomes a stronger habit. It was almost midnight when I finally landed in New Jersey, and my sister picked me up at the airport. And I was feeling worn and tired and hungry and surprisingly light in spirit. Surprisingly light in spirit. So you all have come in a little tired and worn. And this is the second full day of the retreat. And so last night we talked about the hindrances, because that's what always greets us at the door when we come in from a retreat. This evening, what I'd like to do is to kind of step back from all of this and take a much broader view of what this whole meditation project is all about. Buddhism is not a philosophy. It's not a religion. I think at its core, it's not even a spirituality. Certainly not a metaphysics. At its core, what Buddhism is, I think, is just a way of turning towards life. It's a way of engaging life that is turning towards what's going on rather than try to fight it or change it or make it be something different than what it is. This attitude of turning towards was articulated by the Buddha in his first successful sermon, his first successful teaching. It wasn't his first teaching, his first successful one. And right now it's called the, this will be on your quiz tomorrow, you have to memorize this. It's called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. You got that? Okay. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It's in the Samyutta Nikaya, number 5611. So if you're interested in looking it up. So if you're ever not sure how to spell a Pali word, just use a lot of consonant with A's between them and you'll probably be close. You know. So what this Dhammacakkappavattana means is setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. Or I would just translate it a little more loosely and say just getting the ball rolling. You know? So it brought the core of the Buddha's teaching into the world for the first time. So this evening I'd like to go through the sutta with you. I picked the version out of the Samyutta Nikaya because it's relatively short, but it's very, it's got some pieces in it that are missing in some other places. But before I look at the sutta, I thought it would be helpful to get a little background on it. So, as you all probably know, one form and another, the Buddha eventually wound up sitting under, it's called a Bodhi tree, a Pila tree, a fig tree, and waking up, becoming a fully awakened being. And when he woke up, he thought that what he had realized was so subtle and so nuanced and so refined that probably nobody could understand it. And at least that's what's said in the text. But I think also what happens when somebody wakes up is there is actually a very strong draw towards seclusion. There's this deep comfort in just being by yourself. So he spent the first month after his awakening just hanging around the Bodhi tree. I suspect he ate. So there's this little village of Uruvela. Am I pronouncing that right? Uruvela. It was near there. He probably went into the Amra, but basically hung out by himself. And towards the end of that month, he began to realize that there, in fact, were people out there who were very close to waking up. That with a little bit of nudge, a little encouragement, a little pointer in the right direction, that that might be enough. And so he decided to go out and teach. And so he left. I was going to say left Bodh Gaya. It wasn't Bodh Gaya. It's Bodh Gaya now. And he was walking down this road, actually going towards Varanasi. And there was this young ascetic by the name of Upaka who was walking up the road. So he's walking this way, and the Buddha's walking towards him. And Upaka sees this guy who's just glowing, very calm, very peaceful. And he says, what happened to you? Who's your teacher? Whatever this guy had, he wanted to learn more. Who's your teacher? And the Buddha responded in Majjhima Nikaya, this is 2625. His response is, he responded very truthfully. I am one who has transcended all, a knower of all, unsullied among all things, renouncing all. By craving ceasing freed. I have no teacher. No one like me exists anywhere in all the world with all its gods because I have no person for my counterpart. And he continues on like this in verse for several more minutes. So put yourself in Upaka's position. Right? You're walking down some thoroughfare, let's say a subway, and there's this guy who's just glowing there. And you say, wow, who are you? What happened to you? In a friendly way. And he says, I am the accomplished one in the world. I am the teacher supreme. I alone am a fully enlightened one whose fires are quenched and unextinguished. What would you think? Yeah, you wonder if the guy was on drugs or crazy or, what's going on. So the suttas, even the later suttas that are very codified, describe Upaka's reaction. The language in the sutta says, and when this was said, when the Buddha finished, rapping to him, when this was said, the ascetic Upaka said, "May it be so, friend." Shaking his head, he took a bypath and departed. So he took the Buddha to be a nutcase, and just politely scooted out as quickly as he could. So I imagine, Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, just watching this guy scuttling down the trail, and seeing him go and thinking, that didn't go very well. So do you know that feeling? I was a minister for years, and every September, after having been away from the congregation, for usually it was a couple months, I'd have some study time as a vacation. I'd come back in September, and I'd be all charged up, and I was excited with all these new insights, and I would just pour myself into those first sermons, and I would get up there and tell them all this stuff, and at the door, people would say, "Very nice." Wonderful effort. And I'd think that didn't go very well. The problem was that I was just so connected with my own inspiration, my own enthusiasm, all the stuff I wanted to say, that I wasn't connected with all with them. And so what I would do in the next days and weeks is when I was going around to the congregation and visiting people and stuff, I always had this question in the back of my mind. What are they concerned about? What are their interests? And which of those interests do I have anything useful to say anything about? And then within a couple of weeks, they would be greeting at me at the door. It was, "Oh, that was great," or they'd have some comments about the sermon. They'd be, really engaged, with it. So most of us have had those kinds of experiences. When you're so inspired and it just goes right past the person. And I think that's what happened to the Buddha. So being enlightened, being a Buddha, doesn't mean that you know everything about everything. So as Upaka disappeared down that trail, and I can imagine Gautama Siddhartha thinking, that didn't work very well. I need to figure out a different approach. I need another way to convey this material. So a few days later, he came upon 5 monks. These were old friends of his. Before his enlightenment, he spent 6.5 years in training with various teachers, and towards the end of it, a lot of training with these 5 monks. So they had been, they had been brothers, fellow monks supporting each other that he had been close to, very accomplished monks. And this time when he approached them, he paid a little more careful attention to who they were and what their concerns were. And so he spoke in terms that they could relate to. And this time when he spoke, his words really connected. And I would say that the world has not been the same since. It's we right now sitting here are feeling the ripple effects of that. I mean, he could have become a Buddha and been perfectly content under the Bodhi tree and lived out his life without talking to anyone, and we never would have known the guy existed. But he did go out and he found a way, and we're feeling the effects of that. So this brings us to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Boy, I'll get it out yet. So when I read this, bear in mind in these suttas, basically what we are hearing, the words that come through this, come to us through a 2,500-year game of telephone. You know that? So what you're hearing, somebody's interpretation of somebody's interpretation of somebody's interpretation. And a lot of these suttas were actually memorized and passed down by memory for, well, this particular collection is probably 300 years before they were actually written down. So monks would memorize them and pass them on. And so part of what happened in that is the language got codified and kind of standardized. That makes it a lot easier to memorize and pass along. And unfortunately, that same stylization makes it a little more difficult to listen to. You know, so it helped memorization because they didn't have to think about it as much. And when you listen to it, you find yourself not thinking about it as much. So I think it's amazing that as much comes through this teachings as does. And because if you listen carefully, there's just an incredible amount of wisdom and clarity, even though the form is what it is. So, the sutta begins, "Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana. There he addressed the 5 monks of the group." So the opening paragraph here is actually a formula. "Thus have I heard" is a signal that this sutta was transmitted through Ananda. Ananda was his first cousin and was his personal attendant for the last about 20 years of his ministry. And Ananda had repeatedly had what today we call perfect memory. He would hear something once and he had this perfect recall. So after the Buddha died, there was this council of all the monks. Ananda's story is interesting. We'll get to that some other time. But thus have I heard signals us that this was what the monks heard at that first council, and this is how it was passed along. It came through Ananda. And the paragraph, as in many of these suttas, also sets the scene. So in Varanasi at the deer park, which is about 14 kilometers outside of Varanasi. It's still there today, and it's still a deer park, only the deer are put in this little pen. It's really kind of sad. The first time I was there, it was pretty shabby, and then by the time we went back the second time, the Indian government had realized there was really a lot of tourist dollars to be gained, and so they began fixing these places up, including bringing deer in and putting them in pens and stuff. But still, it's inspiring. You actually go and stand there. And the most amazing thing that Erica and I, when we were there, were fortunate enough to see was that when the Buddha died, he was cremated, and his ashes were divided up among various people and passed around, and some of them went back to Varanasi. And so we were there with a group of American pilgrims. And so they opened this stuff up, and we walked in, and there was this big glass case inside a smaller glass case, and inside this little vial, and inside that was this little thing with this little piece that looked like a piece of enamel. And we went in, and the monk is saying, "That's a piece of the Buddha's tooth." So they had gotten these ashes, and there was a little piece of the Buddha, which has nothing to do with the sutta. So in this opening passage, it says he was living in Varanasi, which he wasn't. They all say he was living in this place. We know from other texts that he just arrived there, as I had said. And he addressed this group of 5. And the group of 5 is important. These were ascetics themselves they had trained with. These were highly, highly accomplished monks. So he wasn't talking to, as he did at other times, to cowherds and milkmaids and merchants and people. These were very accomplished people. So if he was talking to beginners, it might have been different. But he was really going for the core here. the Buddha said, "Monks, these two extremes ought not to be indulged by one gone forth from the house life." One gone forth from the house life. That just means that he had left. Gone forth from the house life was a phrase they used for monks. Had left a house life and became barefoot, homeless monks. These two extremes ought not to be indulged by one gone forth from the household life. What are the two extremes? There is devotion to indulgence of pleasures and the objects of sensual desire, which is inferior, low, vulgar, ignoble, and leads to no good. So that's one extreme. Devotion to indulgence. And there's devotion to self-affliction, which is painful, ignoble, and leads to no good. So at that time in India, as I mentioned the other night, there was this belief that spiritual forces and worldly forces were in battle with each other. And so if you could suppress the worldly, then you would strengthen the spiritual. And that's what these monks were involved in, was this asceticism. Eating very little, some of them had no clothes, or some of them wore bark, and some of them walked around with one hand up in the air, all these strange esoteric practices. So that's what he means by this, well, let me back up a minute. So when he says to them, I lost myself. There is devotion to indulgence of pleasure and objects of sensual desire, which is inferior, low, and vulgar. You can just picture all those monks there nodding their heads. Yes, they agree. This is not the way to go. They're in complete accord. But then he goes around and he says that self-affliction is also painful. You know, and that's what they were all involved in. So you could imagine them, they weren't nodding anymore. It was like, what is this guy talking about? So he's got their attention. He's got their attention. At this point, he introduces, for the first time, what's called the middle way, for which Buddhism is now famous. The middle way, discovered by a perfect one, avoids both these extremes. It gives vision and knowledge, and it leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to discovery, to nibbana. And what is this middle way? It is simply the Eightfold Path, which is to say, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. You got all that? The middle way, discovered by a perfect one, which gives vision, which gives knowledge, and which leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to discovery, to nibbana. So you notice the repetition, that last sentence. And the repetition is usually a signal that there's something being said there that's really important. Oftentimes it's repeated 3 times. But I think it's also an artifact of this memorization process. Just make it easier to memorize. The substance of the paragraph introduces this idea of a middle way, okay, and its benefits: vision, knowledge, understanding, peace, awakening, nibbana. So these are in contrast to the extremes of indulgence and self-affliction. This paragraph also introduces the Eightfold Path, which I don't want to go into tonight because that's a whole big topic on itself. And it's actually a little suspect in this place. In later generations, when people repeating the sutta, the people who were listening to these would have understood what the Eightfold Path was, because it was a common doctrine. But at this particular point, to just name these 8 aspects without any explanation seems kind of unlikely. So it's probably what happened was this inserted. However, it's very clear that what what the Buddha meant in the Eightfold Path was stuff that he talked about a lot. So now we get to the heart of the sutta, and this is the stuff that I really want to focus on tonight. It's called the Four Noble Truths. And this is considered like the essence of this. There's the middle way, and then there are Four Noble Truths and what to do with them. And in the sutta, first what he does is describe what each of the Four Noble Truths are, and then he talks about what you do with them. First truth is suffering. Suffering as an ennobling truth is this: birth is suffering, age is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Associating with the loathed is suffering. Separation from loved ones is suffering. Not getting what one wants is suffering. In short, these 5 aggregates affected by clinging are suffering. So in Pali, the language that these suttas are recorded in, the word for suffering is dukkha. And dukkha is the term originally meant, did I say this the other night, a wheel with its axle off center? That's what the term came from. So it kind of presses and grinds. You know? And the Buddha didn't say life is suffering. He said it has suffering. And dukkha was important enough that so there's this long string of what suffering is, and it's not actually a rational, logical definition of suffering. It's given examples of what suffering is. It's sort of like he's saying, you know what suffering is, and he gives a string of things. It's like somebody asks you what green is. I mean, how are you going to tell somebody what green is? You say, well, bell peppers are green, and grass is green, and jade is green. You don't mean that they literally are what green is, but that's what the experience of green is. So what he's saying is that birth, aging, sickness, these are all examples of suffering. He's saying, you guys know what suffering is. This is what I mean by this. Do you want to hear another little sutta? There's this formula that you just hear, birth, aging, suffering, sickness, all that gets the feel kind of stale to me. This is a very short sutta from the Udana, which was probably written down very close to the Buddha's lifetime, maybe during his lifetime, maybe shortly afterwards, and the language hasn't become so codified. There's a little bit in here. It's a very sweet story. I've heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying near Sarvasti in the Eastern Monastery, the place of Megara's mother. And on that occasion, a dear and beloved grandson of Visakha, Megara's mother, had died. So Visakha, Megara's mother, her clothes wet, her hair wet, went to the Blessed One in the middle of the day, and on arrival, having bowed down and sat to one side. As she was sitting there, the Blessed One said, "Why have you come here, Visakha? Your clothes are wet, your hair is wet, in the middle of the day?" When this was said, she said to the Blessed One, "My dear and beloved grandson has died. This is why I have come here, my clothes wet, my hair is wet, in the middle of the day." Visakha, would you like to have as many children and grandchildren as there are people in Sarvasti? Yes, Venerable Sir, I would like to have as many children and grandchildren as there are in people in Sarvasti. The language is a little codified. But how many people in Sarvasti die in the course of a day? Sometimes 10 people in Sarvasti in the course of a day. Sometimes 9, 8, 7, 5, 3, 1. Sometimes only one person dies. Sarvasti is never free of people dying. So what do you think, Visakha? Would you ever be free of wet clothes and wet hair? No, Venerable Sir. Enough of my having so many children and grandchildren. So when he talks about sorrow, lamentation, grief, and despair, I think those phrases were probably coming out of some of these earlier stories. And you can feel the life in them. So the first noble truth, suffering. Second noble truth, the origin of suffering as an ennobling truth is this. Craving makes for renewed existence, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here, now there. That is craving for sensual pleasure, craving for being, craving for non-being. The word for craving here is trumpet flourish. Ta-da! Yes, yes. It's this pre-verbal, precognitive, instinctual tightening that we talked about last night. Tana colors almost all aspects of human experience. Sitting on that airplane when that groan went through all the passengers there, that was like a wave of Tana that was going through there, a wave of aversion. Aversion to sitting on the tarmac, of this desire to get going. When I wistfully wished for Tex-Mex, that was a sort of light, wistful version of Tana. When I was annoyed at the laughing drunk next to me, that was Tana. And when I stared at that Sudoku puzzle, just trying to get my mind off of what was going on inside me, that was Tana. That was Tana. As with dukkha, the Buddha gives examples of Tana. Passion, delight, relishing in one thing and another, wanting sensual pleasantness, wanting to exist or not imagine in the world without us, wanting to shrink away. Again, it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. It's just a bunch of examples. Back to the text, comes to the third truth. Cessation of suffering as an ennobling truth is this. It is the remainderless fading away and ceasing of that same craving. The giving up, relinquishing, freedom from it, releasing it, and non-reliance upon it. So what this is saying is that the source of all our experience of dissatisfaction is this Tana, this tightening. And when the Tana releases, then it fades away. Calls it remainderless fading away. It just means it was really gone. Okay? So that's enough. You got that one, right? So the fourth noble truth, the way of practice leading to cessation of suffering as an ennobling truth is this. It is simply the Noble Eightfold Path. That is to say, wise view, wise intention, skillful communication, skillful action, harmonious lifestyle, skillful effort, wise mindfulness, harmonious collectedness. I translated those terms a little differently, but that's just the Eightfold Path. Okay, so now we come to the essence of it. It's what to do with these. But before I do that, this central core of the sutta, it might be helpful to drill down a little bit into what these four ennobling truths really were all about. During the Buddha's time, there was a common medical formula, how the medicine was organized, where everything had a name and a description. And every disease had a name and description. Every disease had a cause. Every disease had a cure. And every disease had a treatment. So I don't know if you recognize that, but that's the same format of these four ennobling truths. You know, the disease is suffering, the cause is tanah, the cure is cessation, and the treatment is cultivating this way. So that's lost on most of us, but believe me, to the people back there that were listening to this, when he labeled these Four Noble Truths and described them in this way, they would have heard that this was a medical model. So what he's talking about is not a transformational model. It's not changing it as something you're not. It's actually a healing model. It's a disease model. He's saying that, you know, the disease we all suffer from is dukkha. And so that what we're after is actually curing the disease. And part of the implication of this is that diseases hit all of us the same, regardless of caste or status. So at that time, there was a strong belief that the upper caste, you know, were closer to freedom than the lower caste. But he was saying, no, this is available to everyone. This is available to everyone. Another thing that's confusing about the Four Noble Truths is it sounds like the noble is referring to the truth, Four Noble Truths. But in Pali, the phrase is actually irregular. The noble refers to the mind of one who understands them, who understands these truths. There is nothing noble about suffering. There's nothing noble about root canals, you know, and broken legs. You know? There is actually nothing noble about tanha. It's just a biological reflex. And even cessation may bring some relief, but that doesn't make it particularly noble in the cultivating of it. So the noble refers to someone who really understands these and knows how to use them and how to engage in them. Another common misunderstanding of the Four Noble Truths, actually I prefer, Stephen Batchelor refers to them as the Four Ennobling Truths. And I actually prefer that because it kind of gets across that it's really an action, something you're engaged in, and that it's not about the truths, but it's about how you engage in them. Many people misunderstand these four truths as a kind of a catechism, you know, as a kind of statement of faith, as the sort of, you know, what is Buddhism about? It's about the Four Noble Truths. You know, so for example, some of in the Catholic Church, the Nicene Creed begins, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and all things seen and unseen. And the distinction between various versions of Christianity is they have different creeds, slightly different versions. So some people, particularly in Western culture, hear these and think, oh, well, this is the Buddhist version of a creed. We believe that suffering is a part of life. We believe that the origin of suffering is tension. We believe that the cessation of suffering comes from relieving tension. We believe in the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And if you subscribe to all those beliefs, we will give you your Buddhist membership card. Right. But as most, maybe all of us know, the Buddha said, don't believe anything anybody says. Even me, he said, even me. Trust your own deepest experience. So it's obviously not catechism, but some people propose then that therefore what these four truths are things that we're supposed to try on and test out and see if we can verify them in our own experience. Right?
So in that case, this is science, verifiable.
Right.
Experience.
That is, yes, absolutely true. But I don't think that's what he was saying with that. It is true that these things are verifiable, but his saying them was not saying you go out and test these. It was actually subtler. And this brings us to the root of the sutta. See if I left out anything interesting here. Oh, to get at his verifiable. In Christianity and a lot of religions, the basic tenets there are statements about reality that cannot be tested. Right? So there are things about the nature of God and what happens when we die, et cetera, which are not empirically verifiable. And the Four Noble Truths are actually very simple, on the earth, grounded right here. There is suffering. You know, we can verify that. Anyone here never suffered? You know, okay. So they are infinitely verifiable. You know, as I go through this stuff, please feel free to interrupt me. I used to say to my congregation, my job is to speak, your job is to listen, and if you finish your job before I finish mine, let me know, because I'd rather be in dialogue anyway. You know? So feel free to interrupt me at any time. So this is the absolute core of the sutta. Monks. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of suffering. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This ennobling truth of suffering has been fully understood. So let's unpack this a little bit. The passage begins with the Buddha talking about this wonderful, wise, illuminating insight that he has heard. And this is repeated. About 2/3 of this whole passage is this repeating of the same phrase. And the whole thing sounds kind of braggadocio, doesn't it? I had this wonderful thing in here, and I've got this. But you have to remember that, again, this was passed down for many, many years. There is a couple times that I have been close to events that reached the national media, particularly back during the Vietnam War. I was involved in things that showed up on national television. And it was amazing that what came over the public media had very little to do with what I actually saw and knew was going on there. It really had much more to do with the consciousness of the reporter. You know? And so we're dealing with the same thing now. So as this gets passed down to us, translated through all these different languages, what we're hearing in that braggadocio probably has more to do with how it was languaged as it was passed along. The claim, though, that he says this has never been heard before was probably literally true. No, it wasn't probably. I think we can be fairly certain it was literally true. A lot of what the Buddha taught was picked up from other religions and other things that were there, but there were a few things that were brand new with him, and this is one of them. Yeah, that's enough of that. So, what happens if we take this passage and we strip out all this language around it and come down to the core of it? It's basically the ennobling truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Okay. So you hear a lot about the ennobling truth, but what he said was that suffering was to be fully understood. And this was a little puzzling to me because it sounds a little intellectual. You know, it sounds like analysis. But if you just take the word understand, and I went through lots of different translations, and different people translate it differently. This is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. But it's a fairly good one, because if you think about what it means to fully understand someone, or if you feel fully understood, it means that someone sort of empathetically knows what's going on with you, knows how you tick, you know, knows what gets to you, what inspires you, what brings you down. So what he's talking about understanding is not an intellectual process, but really understanding in your guts what suffering is. This is this turning towards, this opening up. We're never going to arrive at that understanding by running away from suffering. You don't have to go seek it looking for it, but when it comes towards you, it's to turn towards and open up and see what's there. And that's what you're doing all the time with a meditation, right? You know, the hindrances come up and you don't like it. Well, the instructions are recognize it, release it. Now, don't get rid of it. Let it be. The release is not pushing away. Allow it to be there. Recognize, release. Then it goes on to the second noble truth, you know, relax the tension in it and so forth. So this is the turning towards. You're not going to get it at arm's length. You have to know it intimately as a precursor to freedom. As a precursor to freedom. So that's the way of engaging the first noble truth. The second noble truth, ennobling truth, monks. I'm going to read this language so you just you get a feel for what it's like to read the suttas. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of the origin of suffering. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of the origin of suffering, is to be abandoned. Is to be abandoned. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth, yet suffering is to be abandoned, that the suffering has been abandoned. So pardon my stumbling through that, but if you strip out the repetitions, the basic action here is that the suffering is to be abandoned. And I went through lots of different translations of different scholars that translated many of these other ennobling truths in lots of different ways, but they all used the word abandon. And I think that there's still a little bit of a problem in translating into English, but if you actually think about what it means to abandon, it means to walk away and leave completely. To me, the word abandon has a little bit of connotation of, you know, leaving a baby on the church steps or something like that, but I don't think that was in the original one. It really means completely getting rid of, relaxing, you know, being done with it.
The bear hasn't seen you leave the area.
That's right. That's right. Abandon the bear.
Well, it connotates an attachment to something. If you're abandoning, I mean, you know, we are
Yeah, I think.
very attached to our pleasures and habits,
Yeah,
consciously and unconsciously.
yeah. And we identify sometimes with our bad habits too. So,
Oh, boy.
yeah, so walking away from those can be, you know, has its own difficulty. So does that make sense? We'll go on to the fourth truth. Monks. Do you want me to read the whole thing? Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight. You got this memorized? An illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of the cessation of suffering. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. This is the ennobling truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. Vision, knowledge, wisdom, insight, and illumination arose within me regarding things never heard before. The ennobling truth of cessation of suffering has been realized. And I would say there's that three-part repetition is very common with things, as I said before, that are very important, with just a subtle difference. There's the naming of it, and that it needs to be realized, that it has been realized. So he's verified all this, he's saying. So the essence of this passage is that suffering is to be realized. The cessation of suffering is to be realized. Do you find that a little confusing or a little redundant? I always did, because talking about tanha and the thing you do with tanha is abandon it. So there's cessation, the realization. So what's that all about? And I think what it's about is that all of us experience the cessation of suffering a lot without realizing what's going on. Right? So one of my favorite examples of this is I like chocolate sundaes. And so I've had some craving. I really want this chocolate sundae, and I want it, and I want it. And then I get the chocolate sundae, and I take that first bite, and it's lovely. It's blissful, right? It's just great. And that bliss lasts for 3 seconds, I don't know, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. And then it starts to fade, and I go for another bite. So what's going on there? We think that that little bliss came from getting the chocolate sundae. But if you look deeply at what's going on, that little bliss came from the cessation of the tanha, the cessation of the wanting. You don't want it anymore because you got it in your mouth, and so it just evaporates, and it's lovely. But particularly in this culture, we confuse the absence of wanting with having what we want. Right? So we, our culture, we are rapidly stripping the planet of its capacity to produce pleasures. And we still want more and more and more, thinking if we get more, that's somehow going to make us happy. It's actually the relaxation of the wanting that does it. Lao Tzu said, "You're rich when you know you have enough." We focus on getting more as opposed to really looking at what's enough.
If you close your eyes and somebody says, open your mouth, and then comes a spoon with this sundae, what then causes the pleasure?
What do you think? It tastes good.
I would say the ice cream.
Yeah. Okay, the pleasure.
This time I didn't want it.
Yeah. So it's a pleasant experience. And with that pleasant experience is the cessation of the desire for it. And so you can see, so you eat more and more ice cream until pretty soon your belly hurts.
I didn't know it was coming. Someone said, open your mouth, close your eyes. It tastes great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pleasant. And so what you're talking about is the confusion between the loss of wanting and this pleasant sensation. Otherwise, it's just a pleasant sensation. But if you think it arises from if you realize that it actually arises from not wanting, and if you can find another way to free yourself from wanting, then you get pleasure without somebody sneaking up behind you and sticking chocolate ice cream in your mouth.
And also dopamine is secreted at the point where you're anticipating actually getting a reward.
Yeah.
That's what makes it very addictive and pulls for further reinforcement of the behavior.
Yeah, and so the dopamine is one of the factors in there, but basically it's a delusion.
Yeah, oh
Yeah. And it's one that is evolutionarily bred into us, because in nature, before we got a hold of it, protein, fruits, tended to be sweet. So, Erica?
What I'm stuck with, after you have that spoonful, that unexpected loveliness, and then there's this, well, that was lovely, I'm eager or I'm excited for another of those experiences, and there's the tanha
Right.
right then.
Right. So the tada comes back, and we think it's pleasurable, but the pleasure is actually in the anticipation. And if we don't sort all that stuff out, then we just become ravenous, you know, and just looking for more and more and more and more. And, you know, in this culture, you know, the depression rate is, you know, some people estimate 45% of the population. We are like the gods on Mount Olympus in terms of our capacity to produce 300 channels of TV and 75 flavors of ice cream and on and on and on.
So, Suda after Suda, Buddha gets up there, goes through the route, and there's all these people that wake up.
Mm-hmm.
What is it in the formula that wakes people up? And what is waking up?
So your job is to meditate for the rest of the night, and you can tell us tomorrow what waking up is.
How many people woke up here?
Well, see, I obviously didn't do it as effectively as he did.
But that's the point. What did he do, or what was it that occurred that in speaking this formula, people actually woke up?
I think that the wisdom, you know, and as we have insights, as the wisdom arises in us, one of the natures of that insight is that it doesn't feel new. It feels like something that's like deeply familiar that maybe we forgot. And I think that he was enormously charismatic. And he had this capacity to actually touch those places and people that already knew this, and to bring that to the surface. And as you look through the different suttas and stuff, you know, he talked to different people in very, very different ways. It was, you know, it was always sort of fine-tuned to what's going on to them. So I think he had this capacity to actually, you know, zero in there and see what was going on and say it in a way that just touched whatever it was that was held or caught in somebody, and then they just got it. And the things and everything released.
So is that a transformation?
It is a transformation from the perspective of somebody who self-identified as a circus clown, and found that actually underneath all that he wasn't a circus clown. But the other way of looking at it was that he actually realized what his true nature had been all the way along, and that he'd just been deluded before.
So is this really a psychology?
Yes. It's a very deep psychology. People make the separation between psychology and spirituality, but I look inside myself and I just see the stuff that's in there. And you know, depth psychology and spirituality, I think, are all looking into the same areas. Western psychology has probably a little more finesse in terms of the complexities of the delusion. You know, we all get caught in a delusion and our neuroses and all our stuff. But Western psychology sometimes forgets that the goal here is to get out of all of it, not just to fix the delusion. You know.
But the positive psychology part of Western psychology is taking in the Buddha's statements and discoveries and finding that they're actually true in terms of applications of how humans actually do react.
Yeah.
Work.
Yeah.
But
That one of the gifts of Western psychology is this capacity to untangle lots and lots of things. And so, you know, if you want to get free sometimes, and you've got a lot of neuroses that are still hanging around, what can be very helpful is somebody who really knows the whole spectrum, you know, if you're looking for guidance.
Because there's a discipline within psychology called positive psychology, which is 25 years ago, this guy said, psychology is only looking at pathology. Let's look at what makes people healthy psychologically. And people said, nah, there's nothing there. And then it developed and developed. And now, you know, Buddha's brain is about that. It's about how positive psychology finds that behaving in ways that are in conformity with Buddhism actually makes you happy and does all the good stuff that's claimed for it, except that it's actually proven in university studies, and it's really taken off, and is a big part of psychology because it's the leading edge, because they'd only looked at pathology up to that point.
Yeah, yeah.
I just have an observation, and that is looking at art and how art transcends all things in many ways. And I was thinking that perhaps that is because most of it provides great pleasure and you can't own it. And you don't expect to own it. It's like nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's there, it's not yours. And the things that offer you that invitation are just so priceless, because you can have a really wonderful, positive experience without grasping.
Mm-hmm. Music is like that as well, because music only exists in the moment. And we humans can be very inventive, and comes all kinds of ways to bring grasping around that. You know, who wants to own the orchestra and all those things. Judy.
I'm going to go back and ask about the word abandonment, because with the suffering, we're going to face the suffering, but with the abandonment, what it comes up for me is turning away from it instead of.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're doing in this practice is that there are some things we need to do, and it's actually narrowing the project down to what's actually the essence. So if you have this whole complex of stuff that's going on, that if you try to change the whole complex, it's just too much. But if you can identify, and this is what we're doing with the 6 R's, if you can identify where the tension is in it and relax that, that tends to be the fuel that drives this whole complex. So it is, some of it's probably the connotation of the word abandonment in English, but if you look at what you're actually doing when you're meditating, it's not abandonment in terms of, throw it out to the wolves. It's just allowing something that is tangled up in itself to untangle. Okay.
And that is the fuel. When it's untangled, it no longer has fuel.
That's right.
I mean, just to go back to the metaphor.
Right. They didn't have cars back then, so the metaphor that Buddha always used was nutriment. What actually feeds it.
So in Theravada Buddhism, you don't hear much about enlightenment, or even to a certain degree waking up. Why is that?
Stephen Batchelor is just absolutely militant about this. And his take on it, and what you see in a lot of religions, Jesus, as well, is that there's a very, very simple, down-to-earth, profound teaching that can be quite liberating. And as you get a couple of generations away, you kind of have specialists, the priests or the monks that kind of own this. And if they can make Nibbana, for example, sound like it's very esoteric and far away and very complicated and hard to get to, then you need this whole monastic structure, to support you in this project. And the monks don't even have to have evil intentions, to do that. They can just grow up over the years. They become the holders of this. And if it sounds unattainable, then keeps them up.
Well,
They still have a job, that's right.
The business gets paid more.
Yes. And what's really radical in all this is that when you realize it's actually simple and is with some few simple techniques. And what the Buddha was teaching, is very powerful, and it's not easy, but it's actually quite simple. And as you experience, those of you who've been doing this practice for any amount of time, you run into states very quickly that you may have thought by traditional Theravadan tradition were unattainable. So the Theravadan tradition, as it comes to us today, comes from Buddhaghosa, who lived 1,000 years after the Buddha, and he wrote this treatise called the Visuddhimagga, where he was trying to find the common ground between all the various strands of Buddhism at that time. And those various strands had a lot of Brahmanism. Old Hinduism had come back in. There is a lot in the Visuddhimagga that is at odds with the earliest suttas as we're looking at. And in the Visuddhimagga, each moment has, 123, little segments, and there's all this incredible analysis and stuff that gets very impressive and just makes it overwhelming. Part of what the Buddha's genius was his capacity to, in a very simple way, see right to what the essence was and just direct it right at that. And people would come at him and ask him about all these esoteric things, and he would just say, I'm not interested. I'm just not interested. And I think, and there are more and more people, within all kinds of the various flavors of Buddhism, who are beginning to come back more and more to these early suttas to try to sort through them. What hasn't been done with the suttas, but has been done, for example, in the Bible, is the Germans started doing it in the 1800s of actually doing a critical literary analysis to go through and see what stuff in the Bible clearly came from the writer, what came from the early church, and what's left may have actually come from Jesus. Nobody's actually done. There are lots of people who are doing that, but it hasn't been done systematically through the Buddhist text to see what. So, for example, in one of these phrases I was reading here, was today or yesterday, the Buddha talked about, before when he was an unenlightened bodhisattva. The word bodhisattva came into use about 300 years after the Buddha died. The term was not around, so he clearly didn't use it. And so there's lots of stuff, to be sorted out in that. Part of the difficulty is Jesus, was around for 3 years between the time he came on the scene and he was killed. Buddha was around for 40 years. So you look at the records we have of Buddha, they're huge. They're huge. There's only about 2/3 of them have been translated into English in any form. So it's just a massive amount of material to go through. But what Bhante Vimalaramsi and others are doing is coming up with a few essential texts and actually going through and trying to do this analysis to pull them apart. Okay, how are we doing? Is that enough for one night? So, let me just pull this together a little bit. Just to restate, some of the things have been hinted at, but there is this sweet, spacious, quivering aliveness that imbues everything. It imbues every moment that we're alive. But it is so tranquil, it is so peaceful, that we can go through months, days, years, entire lifetimes and never see it. What the Buddha was teaching was a way to sharpen and cultivate and open out the awareness so that we can see what's already here. And he didn't talk about it. Because to talk about, this, it begins to sound metaphysical. He didn't talk about it. He just called it awakening or the end of suffering and just left it at that. And you don't get the awareness that can see this if you're fighting reality, if you are fighting things that you don't like, if there is tension in there. He referred to it as dust in your eyes. You don't want to rub your eyes when there's dust in them. What he taught was this way of just seeing things as they are, suffering included, and softening and opening up. And I think there are many of you here, maybe all of you, have had little tastes of that. You know, there's this big thing that comes up that's a problem and you're sitting and you recognize, release, relax, and there's at a moment, and it wasn't even a spoonful of ice cream. Just, there was nothing there. And then the mind revs up again, you know. So he's talking about relaxing into what we are. It's really a matter of surrender. But surrender is very tricky because when we try to surrender and let go, we can surrender into our old habits. And if our old habits would have wake us up, we would have woken up a long time ago. So it's this middle path, you know, of finding ways to soften and open. And in this first sutta, what he says, the full teaching of it, what he's recommending, this full path, is to fully understand suffering and how it operates. And you can't fully understand it if you're running from it. To see how it operates. To abandon the tension in it. Just that little piece. That's the one piece. And when the relief comes from that, to realize that it didn't come from the ice cream, it came from the lack of tanha. And we can do all that stuff and think, this is great. You know, I've got it. You know, had that experience of sitting there on the cushion and think, I've arrived. And then you get up and all those old habits just kick right back in. It can be really discouraging how much force they have. So the fourth thing he talked about were ways, it's the Eightfold Path, of ways of living in the world and living in our lives that cultivate less tanha and more openness, more compassion, more clarity. And when we practice this way or live this way, then this Dhamma that he set in motion 2,500 years ago is actually flowing through us. At least metaphorically. It's like there's this stream that's been started and we are right in the thicket with this. And when we live that way, you know, we become expressions of it. Enough. So, enjoy your practice. And I mean it, that meditation, when it's really working, is fun. If you're not enjoying it, you probably need to smile a little more. It's not this grueling task. There is this thing about turning towards suffering, which is so important. But when you really open up to it, completely, what tends to come out of you is probably more akin to a giggle than anything. A giggle. It's a deep laughter, chuckle. A gigabyte, no. It's so if you've got some more energy, you know, keep sitting, keep practicing. You need to get up and stretch a little bit, that's fine too. If you are worn out, and you know that, sleep is a great remedy.